mansion had been sitting at the top of the hill for as long as anyone in town could remember. People said it was older than most of the streets around it, and anyone who passed by could see its age in the cracked paint and the vines that wrapped around its wooden beams. Some thought it was haunted, others thought it was too far gone to save, but the man who bought it didn't see any of that. He only saw what it once had been and what it could be again if someone gave it the time and respect it deserved. He had been looking for a quiet place outside the noise of the city, somewhere he could work with his hands and not feel rushed. When he found the old mansion listed for sale, he drove out to see it with no real plan in mind. The moment he stepped through the front gates, even with rust shaking beneath his hand, he felt like the house was speaking to him. There was a stillness in the air, the kind that made a person take a deep breath and let go of everything they had been carrying around for years. He bought it 2 weeks later. The property sat just outside the line where a nearby HOA controlled a cluster of modern homes. His mansion, built long before the HOA existed, was clearly not part of any of that. He knew it, the seller knew it, and even the county records made it obvious. It was free territory, no dues, no meetings, no rules, except the ones he set for himself. That alone made the old place feel even more like a sanctuary. He moved in with only a few bags, some tools, and a lot of hope. The first morning, sunlight came through the broken windows and landed on the dusty wooden floors. He didn't feel discouraged. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves and began working. There was something satisfying about repairing what time had damaged. Every board he replaced, every patch he fixed, every nail he drove in made the house feel less abandoned and more alive. Some days he worked from sunrise until the streetlights came on. Some days he only managed a small task like clearing a path through the backyard or polishing an old door handle. But it didn't matter. Progress was progress. Neighbors often slowed down as they drove by, curious about the man restoring the forgotten house. Some waved. Some stopped to ask if he needed tools or a hand. At first, he didn't think much of the attention. After all, it was an unusual sight to see someone taking on such a huge project alone. What he didn't realize was that the attention also caught the eye of people he had never met, people who believed they had a say in things far beyond their borders. It started with a simple white envelope placed neatly in his mailbox. No stamp, no name, nothing except a typed paper inside that read like it was copied from a manual. "Welcome to the community," it said, even though he had already lived there for months. Beneath that greeting was a list of expectations that didn't apply to him and the slightest rules about lawn height. Approved paint colors, parking guidelines, monthly dues, and several other regulations he had no reason to follow. The letter ended with a line instructing him to register his property with the HOA office within 10 days to avoid penalties. He read it twice, confused. He checked the address on the envelope again. It matched his, but the letter made no sense. The mansion was never in their HOA area. Every map, every document, every county line showed it was outside their control. He shrugged it off, assuming it was a mistake, and tossed the paper into a drawer. A week later, he walked outside to find 2 people standing near his fence. Their shirts had the HOA's logo stitched on the front, and they held clipboards like they were conducting an inspection. They didn't introduce themselves before stating that they needed to document the property conditions for compliance. Records. Their tone suggested. They weren't asking. He told them politely that they must be confused. Pointing out that his home wasn't part of the HOA, they didn't argue, but they didn't leave either. One of them scribbled notes, while the other took pictures through the fence. He felt uncomfortable, but he didn't want a confrontation. He simply repeated himself and walked back inside, hoping they would take the hint later that day. Another envelope showed up this time with official-looking stamps. Inside was a notice stating that he had failed to register his property, along with an invoice for the first month of HOA dues and a penalty fee for non-compliance. The charges were small, but the bold language bothered him. It felt like someone trying to claim ownership over something that wasn't theirs. He set the paper aside, telling himself it wasn't worth worrying about. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe someone new at the office had mixed up the addresses. Maybe once he ignored it long enough, they would realize their mistake and stop. But that wasn't what happened. Over the next few days, he saw unfamiliar cars slowing down in front of his house. People he didn't know snapped photos from inside their vehicles. One afternoon, he caught a man standing at the edge of his driveway, pretending to check his phone but clearly watching the renovation work. When he walked outside, the man quickly stepped into a car and drove off. It was strange. It was still not enough for him to think the situation was serious. After all, he was focused on rebuilding the second-floor balcony, which had nearly collapsed years ago. He didn't want drama. He wanted peace, and he assumed things would settle down on their own. They didn't. A third letter arrived, harsher than the previous ones. It stated that his renovation violated architectural guidelines, and that he must stop work until he received approval from the HOA. The words didn't even make sense. How could they demand approval for a property that wasn't theirs? He shook his head, folded the paper, and put it with the others. The next morning, as he carried tools to the porch, he noticed a bright orange tag stuck to his front gate. It looked almost like an official notice from the city, but the fine print at the bottom showed it was from the HOA. It accused him of ignoring previous warnings and demanded immediate action. That was when he started feeling something different, between irritation and disbelief. This wasn't a simple mistake anymore. It was pressure. It was insistence. It was people acting like they had power over him when they did. Later that afternoon, one of the friendlier neighbors stopped by. The older man leaned on the fence and looked uneasy as he explained that the HOA had a habit of trying to pull properties into their control even when they didn't have the right to. He said they believed the mansion affected the image of the community, wanted to claim it so they could enforce their rules. Some homeowners had dealt with similar issues in the past, but most people gave in because they didn't want trouble. The man listened quietly, feeling a slow mix of frustration and disbelief. He wasn't someone who looked for fights. He had come to the mansion to fix something beautiful, not to argue with strangers over imaginary rules. Still, he thanked the neighbor for the warning and promised he would look into it. But as the sun went down that night, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that the letters and visits were only the beginning. Something told him this wasn't going to end with a simple explanation or a cleared-up misunderstanding. For reasons he didn't understand yet, the HOA had decided that his old mansion, his peaceful escape, his months of hard work belonged to them, and they weren't planning to let the matter go. He closed the front door, looked at the half-repped walls around him, and took a deep breath. The place he hoped would bring him peace was becoming the center of unwanted attention. He didn't know how far the situation would go, but he had a sinking feeling that the struggle with the HOA had only just started. The next few days passed in a strange mix of normal work and quiet tension. The man tried to focus on the restoration, but he couldn't ignore the way things seemed to be shifting around him. Every time he stepped outside, he noticed something. Knew another car pausing a little too long near the driveway, another stranger looking up at the house as if they were evaluating it. Another envelope dropped off without a stamp. It felt like the HOA had decided he was their next project, regardless of whether they had any real authority. He tried to stay calm about it, told himself the letters were just noise, and the unexpected visitors were only people curious about the old mansion. Maybe that was true for some. But he could feel in his gut that not all the attention was harmless. One morning, he walked out with a mug of coffee and nearly stepped on yet another envelope. Someone had slipped it directly under his front door while he was asleep. That alone made him uneasy. The tone of the letter had changed again. It wasn't welcoming or polite. It read like a warning. It said he was now months behind on dues, even though he had never paid a single fee because he was not supposed to. It also demanded he pay for exterior violations, listing things like the color of his siding, and the type of plants growing in his yard. He sat at his kitchen table with the letter in his hand and felt a mix of frustration and disbelief wash over him. It wasn't just a mistake anymore. It was intentional. It felt like they were testing how much pressure they could apply before he did what. Other homeowners had done give in, but he didn't want to give in. He had bought the old mansion because he wanted freedom, not someone pretending to own his choices. He pushed the letter aside, deciding it wasn't worth more of his time. Later that afternoon, he went outside to check the new wood he had placed on the balcony. As he lifted one of the boards, he noticed two people walking up the hill toward his property. They weren't trying to hide their presence. One held a clipboard, the other carried a camera. When they reached the fence, they called out to him with a tone that sounded more like an instruction than a greeting. They introduced themselves as members of the HOA's property review team. He couldn't stop himself from laughing softly at how official they tried to sound. He told them again that the mansion was not part of their HOA. He spoke calmly, but the message was firm. Instead of leaving, they insisted they needed to verify compliance and asked him to open the gates so they could do a full inspection. He shook his head, told them they had no right to be on his property. One of them tried to argue, but he didn't budge. When it was clear he wasn't going to give in, they backed away, not before snapping more pictures and scribbling something on their clipboard. As they walked away, he felt a knot in his stomach. There was something unsettling about how confident they acted. It's like they believed they had already won, even though they were completely in the wrong. He went back to work, but the peace he usually felt while fixing the house was gone. His mind kept replaying the interaction. He wondered if ignoring them was the best choice, or if he should have handled things differently, but he didn't want conflict. He just wanted to finish the restoration and enjoy the place he had worked so hard to bring back to life. Later that evening, a neighbor from down the road visited. The neighbor had lived in the area for decades and knew the history of every street and every house. He leaned against the fence and spoke in a low voice, telling the man he should be careful. The neighbor said the HOA had been getting more aggressive over the years. They worried more about control than community. They believed every property near them should follow their standards, and if something didn't fit their idea of how the neighborhood should look, they tried to force it into their system. The neighbor apologized for the trouble and said he admired the work being done on the old mansion. Before leaving, he said something that stuck with the man long after the conversation ended. They think pressure always works. They don't expect anyone to push back. That night, he laid in bed staring at the ceiling. He didn't want to be part of a fight, but he also didn't want to be bullied. He reminded himself that the mansion had stood for 80 years. It had seen storms, winters, and more than a few tough times. It wasn't giving up, and neither was he. The next morning seemed normal enough until he walked down the driveway and saw something that made him freeze. A sticker had been placed on his work truck. It wasn't a city notice. It wasn't a safety warning. It was an HOA violation tag accusing him of parking an unapproved vehicle in front of his home. The problem was the truck was parked on his own land, not on any shared road. The sticker made him feel a surge of irritation. He peeled it off, but the sticky residue remained. He looked around, wondering who had put it there. He didn't see anyone, but he had a feeling he was being watched. For the first time, he realized the situation wasn't just annoying, it was crossing into his personal space. He didn't like that. He walked back inside, trying to shake off the feeling, but it stayed with him. A few hours later, a white SUV pulled up. It wasn't a police car, but the people inside wore badges around their necks. They walked up to him and introduced themselves as part of a compliance enforcement team. He recognized the logo on their badges. It belonged to the HOA. They claimed they were there to discuss his growing list of violations. He kept his voice calm as he explained once again that his property was not governed by their HOA. They didn't accept his explanation. One of them even suggested he must have missed a document or misunderstood the boundaries. He didn't appreciate the implication. He knew exactly where his property lines were. The land had been clearly marked years before the HOA even existed. The conversation dragged on longer than he wanted. Eventually the team left, not before saying he should expect further action if he didn't comply. He watched them drive away and felt a heavy discomfort settle over him. This wasn't a small issue anymore. This was a group trying to convince him of something he knew was false. They weren't listening. They weren't reasonable. They were determined. That evening, he walked through the mansion, checking the repairs he had made over the past months. The place looked different, now, stronger, brighter, full of life again. He had put his heart into every part of it. He didn't want anyone telling him how he should make it look or what he should pay to keep it. He sat on the old staircase and thought about everything that had happened. The letters, the warnings, the strangers taking photos, the sticker on his truck. The so-called enforcement visit was all adding up. It wasn't just about dues or rules. It was about control. He picked up the stack of letters he had shoved in a drawer and spread them out on the table. Reading them again, he saw how the tone had shifted from polite to demanding, from suggestive to threatening. It made his chest tighten. These weren't simple mistakes. They were attempts to scare him into submission. He looked out the window at the fence line. The sun was setting, and the sky was turning shades of gold and orange. For a moment, he felt a sense of calm return. The mansion still stood strong, just as it always had.
Ow.
The land was still his. Nothing the HOA sent or said could erase that fact. But he also understood something important. Important ignoring them wouldn't make them stop. They seemed used to people giving in, and they had likely convinced themselves they would get the mansion under their control eventually. That meant they would only push harder. He wasn't someone who liked conflict, but he wasn't someone who backed down from what was right. He had restored the mansion piece by piece. He had faced days of exhaustion, tight budgets, and whether that made work impossible. He didn't let any of that stop him. He wasn't about to let a group of strangers claiming false authority stop him either. The more he thought about it, the clearer the path became. He needed to be prepared. He needed to gather proof, understand the laws, and protect what was his. If the HOA wanted to apply pressure, he needed to make sure he knew how to stand firm. He collected the letters into a folder, took pictures of the orange tag, and wrote down the dates of every visit and every strange sighting. It wasn't about revenge. It was about being ready. He went to bed that night feeling uneasy, but also determined. The HOA had made their intentions clear, and now he had to make his own intentions just as clear. He wasn't going to be pushed around. He wasn't going to be tricked. He wasn't going to lose the place he had worked so hard to restore. The mansion had survived 8 decades, and he had survived enough challenges in life to know when to stand firm. He didn't realize it yet. But the pressure from the HOA was only going to grow from here. More letters would come, more attempts would be made. But for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever was coming next, and something inside him whispered that the real fight had not even started. For the next week, everything around the mansion felt heavier, like the air itself had changed. The man tried to keep his routine steady, repairing floorboards, scraping paint and replacing old fixtures, but even simple tasks felt different now. Every sound outside caught his attention. Every unfamiliar car made him pause. He didn't want to live in fear or frustration, but the pressure from the HOA was growing in ways he could no longer ignore. One day, while repairing a window frame, he heard the crackle of gravel under tires. He glanced outside and saw a sedan slowing to a stop right in front of the house. A woman stepped out with a folder under her arm. She walked with careful steps, like she was rehearsing her approach. She knocked on the gate politely, and he walked over, hoping maybe this was finally someone reasonable. She introduced herself as part of the HOA administration office. Her voice was calm and friendly, but her eyes kept flicking toward the house as if she was measuring every detail. She said she wanted to clear up misunderstandings and suggested they have a conversation. He stayed on his side of the fence, not opening the gate. He didn't want things getting too comfortable. She explained that the HOA believed the mansion fell under their boundaries because of a new map they had drafted. That made him raise an eyebrow. A new map wasn't legally binding. The land records hadn't changed. The county lines hadn't moved. Someone couldn't just draw a new map and expect everyone to follow it. He told her all of that calmly, making it clear he wasn't being rude, just firm. Her friendly tone faded a bit, and she tried a different angle. She said that even if the house wasn't technically part of their area, the HOA wanted all nearby homes too. Maintain the overall neighborhood look, as she suggested. He'll allow them to review his renovation plans so they could guide him in making choices that matched the community. He felt himself getting frustrated again, but he didn't show it. He simply told her he was restoring the mansion to its original form, not trying to create a modern home that needed approval. She kept smiling, but the smile felt thin. After a few attempts to convince him, she finally said they hoped he would cooperate and left. When he went back inside, he felt a strange mix of calm and pressure. On one hand, the conversation hadn't escalated. On the other, it confirmed that the HOA wasn't letting go of their goal. They weren't backing down, even though they had no grounds. 2 days later, he woke to the sound of a vehicle idling outside. He looked out the window and saw 2 people wearing safety vests and carrying clipboards walking along the fence. They didn't knock or call out. They were writing things down like they were gathering evidence. One of them pointed at the roof. The other circled something on their paper. He walked out and asked what they were doing. They said they were conducting an exterior review. Told them, once again, that they had no right to do that. They didn't argue. Instead, they just kept writing and then walked away like their job was already done. He felt something inside him tighten. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was persistence, relentless, uncomfortable persistence. That afternoon, he called the county office to verify everything once more. The clerk pulled up the records and confirmed what he already knew. The mansion was outside the HOA jurisdiction. There were no shared roads, no common areas, no overlapping zones, nothing. The property was entirely independent. The clerk sounded puzzled as to why the HOA would be sending him letters at all. The man thanked her and hung up, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. The facts were on his side. But facts didn't seem to matter to the people causing him trouble. As the days passed, weird little changes started happening around the edges of his property. Someone placed small flags along the side of the road as if marking boundaries. A new sign appeared farther down the hill, saying Neighborhood Standards Area Begins. He wasn't sure who put it there, but he had a strong guess. One evening, he saw a group of 3 people standing in front of the house, pointing at the windows and porch. They talked among themselves and took photographs. He walked outside slowly, not wanting to escalate anything, and asked if he could help them. They quickly said they were documenting changes for community improvement records. He told them he didn't consent to any recordings or inspections on private property, but they didn't stop until he stepped closer. Only then did they leave. He watched them go. Wondering how far this would go, he went back inside and sat at the table with his folder of letters. The stack was getting thicker. The tone of the newest letter was colder, warning him about an assessment for overdue fees. It even mentioned the possibility of a lien. That made his eyes narrow. A lien? On a property they didn't own? That crossed a line from annoying to unacceptable. That night, he sat on the porch thinking things through. The sunset painted the sky orange, and he rested his arms on the railing he had rebuilt with his own hands. He had poured months of work into restoring the place. He had sanded floors until his back ached, and patched walls until his fingers were sore. The house wasn't just a project, it was something he felt, was connected to, and the idea of someone threatening it in any way felt deeply wrong. He decided he needed help, not because he was scared, but because he wanted to do things right. He wanted to protect himself and the mansion without losing his temper or making mistakes. The next morning, he drove into town and visited a legal office that handled property disputes. He explained everything from the first letter to the strange visitors. The stickers, the photographs, the warnings, the fake boundaries, and the implied threats. The attorney listened carefully, taking notes and asking questions. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair and gave him a look that told him she had seen cases like this before. She explained that some HOAs tried to overstep, especially when they believed a nearby property affected their appearance or control. They counted on homeowners giving in to avoid conflict. But she also told him he had more rights than he realized. County records were clear. The mansion was not theirs. They had no legal authority to enforce anything, and any attempt to place a lien or charge fees could actually backfire on them. The man felt something loosen in his chest, a little relief at last. The attorney suggested he start documenting everything in detail and saving every letter. She also offered to draft a formal notice stating that the HOA must stop contacting him and must cease all attempts to interfere with his property. The notice would reference the law directly. It would make it clear that further pressure could be seen as harassment. He agreed. She told him to expect pushback, because organizations that liked power rarely backed down without trying a few more angles. But she assured him that the law was on his side. He left the office feeling steadier than he had in weeks. When he returned to the mansion, he saw another envelope in the mailbox. He sighed, picked it up, and opened it. This one claimed he had refused cooperation and warned of escalated action. The language was bold and unsettling, but instead of feeling fear, he felt frustration turn into resolve. He placed the letter into his folder and set it down on the table. He didn't like conflict, but he realized he wasn't fighting alone anymore. He had facts, records, and now someone who knew how to handle situations like this. A few days later, a certified letter arrived from the attorney's office. It was the formal notice she had promised. He handed it to the HOA office the same afternoon, making sure it was received. The reaction didn't take long. The very next morning, a car pulled up. A man stepped out, looking more serious than anyone who had visited before. He said he was from the HOA board. He held a copy of the attorney's notice and was visibly irritated. He tried to argue that the HOA's authority was justified. He claimed the mansion was within influence range, whatever that meant. But the homeowner didn't argue. He simply repeated what the attorney told him. Any further attempts to enforce rules or demand payments would be considered harassment and reported. The board member didn't like that answer. He walked away stiffly, muttering something under his breath. That evening, the homeowner walked around the property, checking each part of the mansion again. The porch was solid. The new balcony rails were smooth. The restored windows gleamed in the sunset. He felt proud of the work he had done and protective of the place he had rebuilt. He didn't know what the HOA would try next, but he could feel something building. The pressure wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time since the trouble began, he felt prepared. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was ready to take a stand if he had to. And deep down, he knew the day was coming when the HOA would push too far enough that he wouldn't just defend himself. He would fight back through the right channels, and they wouldn't be expecting that. For several days, the mansion felt strangely quiet. Even though the work crews continued their jobs and the main character kept moving from room to room, checking details and making notes, but under that normal surface, he felt something changing. He had pushed the HOA into a corner by refusing to sign anything, and the discovery about the forged documents had clearly shaken them. Still, he sensed that they were not done. People like that never accepted defeat quietly. They tried again, usually with a different type of pressure. The week started with harmless things, little hints that spread around the neighborhood. A few locals who usually greeted him with a smile had suddenly become quiet. Some gave quick nods, but avoided eye contact. Others acted like they had heard something but did not want to say it out loud. He noticed it while buying supplies at the hardware shop, while ordering paint, even while filling his truck with fuel. He could feel whispers brushing behind him the moment he passed by people. He knew the HOA had started a rumor campaign. It wasn't hard to guess. Nothing bothered those board members more than losing control. And when they couldn't pressure someone with money, they tried to ruin the person's reputation instead. Still, he tried not to let it get to him. He focused on the mansion because every day the place looked more alive. The hallways were almost fully restored. The sunroom had regained its old shine. And the garden finally showed signs of order instead of chaos. Sometimes he stood at the top of the staircase just to take in the transformation, reminding himself that this was bigger than any HOA argument. He was preserving history. Nobody had the right to bully someone out of that. But late one afternoon, as he was loading tools into his truck, a stranger approached the property. The stranger looked nervous, almost guilty, as if he wasn't supposed to be there. He carried a folder filled with papers, and even before he spoke, the main character had a feeling it had something to do with the HOA. The man cleared his throat softly before saying he needed to talk. He didn't seem threatening, more like someone uncomfortable about his task. He explained that he had been hired as a third-party contractor to value certain properties in the area for the HOA. He paused several times, choosing his words carefully, then admitted the main character's mansion had been singled out by the HOA as a target for a revised structural assessment. At first, the main character didn't fully understand. A structural assessment didn't sound dangerous. But then the man explained the truth. The HOA wanted to declare the mansion unsafe, which would allow them to demand immediate repairs under their supervision, or even issue forced compliance notices. In simple words, they wanted legal grounds to control the mansion or burden it with huge fines. The main character felt frustration rising, but he kept calm. He asked the man whether he had seen anything unsafe himself. The man looked around at the freshly repaired walls, the stable balconies, the new support beams, and said everything looked solid. He admitted he didn't agree with the HOA's complaints but was required to follow instructions. The main character thanked him and asked for a copy of whatever paperwork he had. The man hesitated but eventually handed it over. He even apologized, saying he didn't want trouble but also didn't want to help anyone cheat the system. He left quickly, looking relieved the interaction had been peaceful. Back inside the mansion, the main character sat at the wide dining table and read every page. The HOA had listed a long set of false claims cracks that didn't exist, electrical hazards that had already been repaired, water damage that had never been present. It was obvious they were hoping he couldn't disprove everything fast enough. They wanted to overwhelm him. For a moment, he let his hands rest against the table. He wasn't angry, he was tired. Tired of the games, tired of the tricks, tired of the constant interference, when all he wanted was to fix a historic place and mind his own life. He wasn't trying to bother anyone, yet they treated him like a threat. But the feeling of exhaustion lasted only a few minutes. Something inside him pushed back, stronger than before. He knew he had proof. Photos from every step of the restoration, permits, written reports, and receipts. If the HOA wanted to create a false narrative, he could create a stronger one backed by real evidence. So he began organizing everything. He spent hours sorting files, scanning documents, and labeling photos. He wrote dates on folders and arranged them in order. By the time the sun had disappeared behind the hill, he had enough material to counter every accusation. It took time and effort, but the mansion deserved that level of defense. The next morning, things escalated again. He stepped outside and saw a row of small orange markers placed along the front yard. They were spaced evenly, like survey points. For a moment, he simply stared, unsure what they meant. Then he saw the note taped to the porch railing. It was a notice from the HOA stating that boundary evaluations were underway to determine whether parts of his land overlapped with community property he'd lived through. Enough HOA tricks to understand what that really meant. They were trying to say portions of his land might belong to them more, at least. They wanted to create the illusion of that. If they succeeded, they could claim rights to his driveway, his garden, or even the space in front of the mansion. And once they had any foothold, they would push for more. Not long after, a group of HOA board members arrived. They didn't ask permission. They simply walked up the path and gathered in front of him, pretending to act official and calm. Their leader spoke with a practiced, polite tone. Explaining that they were only following procedure, he talked about rules, boundaries, community harmony, and several other vague phrases that didn't mean anything real. The main character didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult them or create conflict. He simply asked for one thing: proof of any authority they had to conduct such an evaluation. The board members didn't expect that. They exchanged confused looks, shuffled papers, and mumbled. Finally, one of them admitted they didn't have the required signatures yet. It was the opening he needed. He told them clearly and firmly that until they produced legal authorization, not vague papers or made-up agreements, they had no right to enter his land or make any changes to it. Then he reminded them that he had evidence of their previous false claims and could report their conduct to the proper offices if they continued. The board members left in silence, pretending to be offended but clearly shaken. That evening, after the tension of the day had faded, the main character walked around the mansion's exterior. The lights he had installed along the walkway gave the old structure a warm glow. For the first time in days, he felt a moment of calm. The place looked strong and peaceful, like it had weathered bigger storms than any modern committee could bring. Still, knew the HOA had not reached the end of their efforts. They would try something bigger next. Something that could not be blocked with a simple conversation. Something that targeted the legality of the mansion itself, and he was right. 2 days later, an envelope arrived. It wasn't dropped off casually. It was hand-delivered by a courier who wore a badge and required a signature. The envelope was thick, heavy, and filled with printed pages. When he opened it, he saw the words he had expected. The HOA had filed an official complaint with the county. They were accusing him of multiple violations, including ignoring community rules, altering historic property without oversight, refusing assessments, and creating community disruption. None of it was true. Not one sentence matched reality. But the complaint meant only one thing. The HOA had moved the fight beyond simple intimidation. Now they wanted to use formal law against him. He paced through the mansion slowly, reading each page carefully. Every corner of the house suddenly felt heavier, as though the walls could sense the challenge ahead. He knew he needed a strong response, something that couldn't be twisted or ignored. That night, he sat at the old writing desk in the study, surrounded by boxes of evidence. He worked for hours, drafting his reply, organizing files, and writing down every detail he remembered. He didn't exaggerate anything. He didn't add emotion. He simply wrote the truth. By midnight, he had a complete record ready to send to the county. It included permits, receipts, structural reports, and photographs from every angle. He placed everything neatly inside a large folder. The final page was a clear statement. The HOA had been making false claims. He was prepared to take the matter to court if necessary. He wasn't trying to prove he was stronger. He wasn't trying to win a fight for the sake of winning. He simply wanted fairness. He wanted peace. He wanted to restore his mansion without being forced or tricked into handing over control. Before he went to sleep, he walked out onto the balcony overlooking the town. He could see the faint lights in the distance. The night air was cool against his face. Despite the stress, he felt a kind of quiet determination. The HOA had pushed him far enough. If they wanted to turn this into a legal battle, then that was exactly what he would give them. He would not back down. Not now. Not after everything he had rebuilt. The mansion stood behind him, tall and steady, as if encouraging him. It had survived 80 years. It had survived neglect and time. He would make sure it survived this challenge too. Whatever the HOA planned next, he was ready. The morning after he prepared the folder for the county, he woke up earlier than usual. The sun was only beginning to rise, sending soft light across the mansion walls. Normally, he would take a few minutes to breathe in the quiet of the house, but that day felt different. It felt like something was shifting. Not in a dramatic or frightening way, but in a way that made him feel he was standing at an important point in his life. He knew the conflict with the HOA had reached its final stage. Whatever happened next would decide the direction of everything. He got dressed, ate a quick breakfast, and placed the thick folder carefully in his bag. He double-checked the pages inside, even though he already knew everything was organized. The evidence was solid. He had the truth on his side, and for the first time since the HOA first confronted him, he felt a steady confidence instead of stress. He locked the mansion door and walked down the long path toward his truck. The cool air brushed across his face, carrying the smell of morning dew and fresh soil from the garden. The mansion behind him seemed almost proud, as though it knew he was fighting for its history, not for his ego. He ran a hand along the stone wall before getting in the truck. Quietly promising the old place that he would see this through, the drive to the county office took nearly 40 minutes. During the trip, he didn't turn on the radio. He didn't need background noise. His mind was already full. He thought about how far things had come from the day he first stepped onto the property with excitement. Ready to restore a forgotten treasure? To all the unexpected fights with an HOA that couldn't accept anyone doing things without their control? It still amazed him how people could twist simple intentions into conflicts. When he reached the parking lot of the county building, he paused before getting out. He looked up at the tall structure with its wide glass windows reflecting the morning sky. He wasn't nervous, not exactly, but he knew how important this moment was. If the county accepted the HOA's complaint, the fight could drag on for months, maybe years. If the evidence he provided was recognized, then the whole situation could turn around. Inside the building, everything felt clean and quiet. A few people waited in line, holding papers or folders, each dealing with their own issues. He stepped up to the counter when it was his turn and politely told the clerk he was submitting a formal response to a complaint. The clerk looked at the envelope, flipped through the first few pages, and nodded. She stamped the documents with careful precision before handing him a receipt. "That's all for now," she said with a small smile. "You'll receive updates by mail." He thanked her and left the building feeling lighter, though he knew the matter wasn't finished. This was only the beginning of the final process. On his way back to the mansion, he tried not to imagine how the HOA would react once they learned he had submitted a detailed, organized response. He expected them to be angry, maybe even surprised. They had assumed he would panic or give up. Instead, he had turned everything around, calmly and with evidence. When he reached home, walked through each room slowly, checking the progress of the restoration. Doing so always helped clear his mind. The living room smelled of fresh wood polish. The kitchen looked bright with the new cabinets installed. The grand staircase had been finished the day before, and the smooth railing felt firm under his hand. Walking through the mansion reminded him why this fight mattered. It wasn't about winning against the HOA. It was about protecting something worth preserving. A few days passed quietly. No sudden visits. No new notices on his porch, but he knew silence didn't mean everything was over. Silence often came right before the next move. Late one afternoon, as he was tightening a light fixture in the upstairs hallway, he heard a vehicle door close outside. Not many people visited without warning. He looked out the window and saw a sedan from the county inspector's office. This time, it wasn't someone hired by the HOA. It was an official inspection ordered directly by the county. He walked downstairs calmly and opened before the inspector knocked. The inspector introduced himself politely and showed identification. He explained that he was there to review the claims made by the HOA and to see whether the accusations had any merit. Instead of feeling nervous, the main character felt relieved. Finally, someone who wasn't taking sides. Someone who was just doing a job fairly. He invited the inspector inside and guided him through the mansion. They went room by room. The inspector checked wiring, walls, beams, outlets, windows, doors, everything mentioned in the complaint. Each time he examined something, he made notes on a clipboard. He never rushed, but he didn't drag things out either. An hour passed, then another. By the third hour, the inspector had seen the entire interior and most of the surrounding land. He stopped near the front steps, took a deep breath, and looked toward the mansion. "This place is in excellent condition," he said simply. "Whatever issues it had before, they've been taken care of properly." The main character nodded and thanked him. He didn't celebrate or express relief out loud. That wasn't his style. But deep down, he felt something inside his chest loosen. It's like a knot finally untangling. The inspector also said he would file a full report within a few days. He added in a calm voice that the HOA's claims appeared exaggerated or unsupported. He didn't say it with judgment, just as an observation. After the inspector left, the main character stood alone for a while, letting the moment settle. For the first time in weeks, he felt a genuine sense of progress. But progress didn't mean the HOA was done. The next morning, a letter arrived in the mailbox. It wasn't another complaint. This time, it was something entirely different. The HOA had offered him a settlement proposal. They wanted to dismiss tensions by suggesting he pay a large fine and agree to follow their community improvement plan. The letter was worded nicely, as if they were doing him a favor. But underneath the polite language, the message was clear. They were trying to pressure him into giving them control. He read the letter twice. Not because he was confused, but because he couldn't understand how they thought he would fall for it. After everything they had tried, after every unfair action they had taken, they still believed he would just bend. He folded the letter neatly, placed it back inside the envelope, and set it aside. He didn't need to respond to it. The county's investigation would speak louder than any settlement offer. 2 days later, he received another visit. This time, it was the same group of HOA board members who had come during the boundary marking incident. They walked up the path as if they wanted to appear collected and confident, but he could sense nervousness in their expressions. The leader of the group began talking about misunderstandings and hoping for peaceful solutions. He mentioned how the neighborhood valued cooperation, how they preferred dialogue over disputes. The words sounded rehearsed, like something practiced in front of a mirror. The main character listened quietly. When the leader paused, he asked one simple question. "Did you tell the county the truth when you filed your complaint?" None of the board members answered immediately. They glanced at each other, as if each person hoped someone else would speak first. Eventually, the leader said they followed procedures as they understood them. But the hesitation in his voice revealed the truth. Instead of arguing back, the main character simply said that the inspector had already sent a preliminary notice stating the accusations were unconfirmed. The moment he said that, the group's expression changed. Their confidence dropped. Their polite tone vanished in seconds. They left shortly after, clearly frustrated but without another word. A few more days passed, and something unexpected happened. A neighbor he barely knew approached him while he was tending to the newly planted flowers near the walkway. The neighbor looked uncomfortable at first, but soon began explaining that the HOA had been spreading stories around the communities, claiming he was breaking rules, causing trouble, and refusing cooperation. The neighbor apologized, saying he didn't believe any of it after seeing how peaceful the mansion restoration had been. He just wanted to let the main character know what was being said behind the scenes. Instead of feeling angry, the main character felt grateful, not because someone had taken his side, but because it reminded him that people could still be honest and decent even in situations controlled by loud voices. When the county's final report arrived, it was thick, official, and clear. The inspector had listed every detail, every repair, every examination. The conclusion was placed on the last page. No violations found. The report also included a note recommending an inquiry into the HOA's repeated false claims. It wasn't an accusation, it was a suggestion that the county should look into the board's conduct. He read the report slowly, then read it again, just to let the words sink in. The fight that had drained so much energy was finally reaching a turning point. The truth was documented. The evidence was acknowledged. For the first time in a long while, he felt the tension in his shoulders release completely. The HOA tried one last tactic. They called an emergency meeting and invited every resident in the neighborhood. They planned to make a speech about community order and shared responsibility, hoping to influence people before the county took action. He was invited to, but he didn't go. He didn't need to defend himself anymore.